to Poetics, where poetry finds its voice. I am Tamarah Rockwood, and I believe that poems weren't made to sit still. They're meant to be spoken, felt, and lived. Here on Bainbridge Island, where gray skies and salt air are part of the rhythm, my husband Ben and I run Bainbridge Island Press. We publish poets who write from somewhere real, but publishing is just the beginning. These words need breath behind them. They need to be heard. And today, we are pairing poetry with rain, the steady kind, the kind that taps on windows and makes you stay a little longer, the kind that blurs the edges and turns everything inward. Rain has always belonged to poets. It is grief and renewal in the same drop. It is the excuse to cancel plans and the reason to finally sit down and write. So, here in the Pacific Northwest, we don't fight the rain. We learn to live inside it. And poets have been doing that for centuries, finding language for something that falls without asking permission. So, you pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let's read. Welcome to Poetics. Now, I'm going to open a book today that I just got, and it's quite a book. So, before I tell you what it is, it's the title, you probably already know. That being said, what I want to say about it is today's poet knew rain. He wrote it as a steady rainy wind tearing into a sail. He wrote it as a spray loosening already weak ropes. He wrote it as a hostile sea where amnesia falls in the midst of night. We are going to spend some time today inside one of the most influential books of love poetry ever written, in a translation that has just landed on my desk and has not left it since. It has traveled with me in my backpack, in my purse, in the car. It is part of who I am right now. This is A.M. Jester's New English Canzoniere of Petrarch, and it's published by Liveright, and it was just released this April, so just a few weeks ago. But it is a long and generous introduction by Andrew Frisardi. I can't get enough of this book. Opening this book is like picking up a folio of Shakespeare for the first time. Where do you start? You start at the beginning. And that's what Jester does. In collaboration with Frisardi's introduction, this is a walk with Petrarch through the history of his career, through the history of his exiles, his journeys, his wanderings, and the arrival, finally, in love with Laura. By the time the introduction concludes and you turn to the first poem, you feel as though Petrarch has handed you this envelope himself, and you tear open the side and just watch as hundreds of love poems fall out in front of you. And I have to confess that I am in love with Petrarch now. Who am I? How did this happen? Well, this is how it happened. For listeners who have not encountered Petrarch before, and also this is not going to be the only time I get into this book. I've been reading it for the past few weeks. I imagine I will have more things to say later. It's just such a book. But here's the briefest possible orientation. So Petrarch was born in 1304. He died in 1374. He's often called the first humanist, or the father of the Italian Renaissance. His own title, which is Canzoniere, it's obviously Latin, Rerum Vulgarium Fragmentia, which is fragments of things in the vernacular. He also called it the collection Rima Sparse, which is scattered rhymes. The book contains 366 poems. Most of them are about a woman named Laura. So what I want to do today is just open this book in 3 movements. The first are 3 interesting things about the poems themselves. The second are 3 surprising ways that the form holds the poetry. And the third is 3 things that I learned about Petrarch's life and how each of those biographical facts changed the way that I read his lines. So we will start here by entering into Petrarch himself, as he ends so often, on a sea with a vessel and a soul and a question about who is steering. So the first thing, so I wrote down 3 interesting things about the poems. Laura is not Beatrice. Now, as I said, this is my first foray into Petrarch as a book. So I know who Laura is now, and I don't know who Beatrice is. So I will figure that out later. So Laura is not the guide. She is not the lady who leads the soul up to the spears into Empyrean. She is a woman with a name. She is a fact in the world. The speaker's relationship to her is not a clean ascent. It is, as Frisardi pointed out, alternately euphoric, tormented, and turbulent, which, I mean, what woman isn't? But it is also shot through with guilt. And so the very first poem in the book is a confession addressed to the reader. So a couple lines from that. To you who hear within these bits of rhyme the sound of sighs that used to feed my heart throughout my youthful follies, when in part I was somebody from another time. The opening sonnet is an apology. The poet is asking for pity and pardon for his crime. The crime is having loved Laura the way he did and having written about it. So before we even meet Laura, we meet a man who has made peace with the fact that loving her may have been the wrong shape of love. And I'm happy to say, I'm sorry to say, that tension never resolves. It just deepens. And these collection of poems, these fragments of rhyme, is not a love story so much as this long argument with the speaker's own desire. Oh, I'm so in love with this. Okay, number 2, second interesting thing about this. The aura is everywhere. There's a small thing that becomes, once you notice it, the whole music of the book. Laura's name in Italian is also almost a pun on la aura, or the breeze, or the air. And Petrarch builds entire poems around this acoustic shimmer. You're going to buy this book. Open the book to poem 239, and you can watch Jester translate the technique in slow motion. The end words of the stanzas rotate in this fixed pattern of aura and flowers and poetry and notes and soul and power, and they come back and they come back in the same 6 words. And here's how it begins. Near dawn, At moments when a gentle aura in the new season often stirs the flowers and tiny birds begin their poetry, I feel the sweetest musings in my soul. And by the end of the poem, the speaker is asking poetry itself to enchant a serpent. Aura, flowers, poetry, notes, soul, power. The beloved is the breeze. The breeze stirs the flowers provoke the poetry. The poetry sings to the soul cannot reach the power is also the beloved. It's this closed circle, and this closed circle is the form itself, and this is what Petrarch can do that almost no one has done since. And the beloved is dispersed into the language, and you cannot point to her. You can only feel the wind move through. Now, the third very interesting thing were the Babylon sonnets, which are scandalous. The third interesting thing was that this book got banned. Petrarch spent many years at the papal court in Avignon, and that was where popes lived instead of in Rome, and he hated it. He called it Babylon. And in his poems, 136 to 138, he wrote 3 sonnets so scathing about the corruption of the papal court that the Catholic Church placed him on the Index of Forbidden Texts, where they remained from the 16th century to the 18th century. So let's listen to how the poem 138 opens. Font of grief, house of anger, school for lying as well as temple of apostate, false, wicked Babylon, Rome, formerly, for which there is much tearfulness and sighing. 2 centuries on the banned list for a love poet. So this is telling us something important. This collection of poems is not just an emotional autobiography. This is also a political document. It is a religious document. It is a 14th century critique of institutional power. It is dressed in lyric clothing. Petrarch is arguing with the church even as he prays in it. I told you, I'm going to be revisiting this book a million times. These are just wonderful. So I want to pause here and tell you about the man who made this English Petrarch possible, because the more you know about A.M. Jester, the more remarkable this volume becomes. So A.M. Jester is a pseudonym. It's also an anagram. So the poet's name is Michael J. Oster, and for many years, his readers had no idea that the formal poet that they were following in poetry and the Paris Review and the Hudson Review was the man serving in senior positions for 4 United States president, including a stint as the commissioner of the Social Security Administration, and his first, I don't want to say that his cover was blown in 2010, because that sounds like a political conspiracy, but there was a poet named Paul Mariani, and he revealed Jester's identity in First Things. And by then, he had already been publishing translations and original verse under the pen name for many, many years. So he lived 2 lives, which, amazing man. One in law and policy and biotechnology, and one in formal verse. And the 2 have not interrupted each other, but sustained each other. So he says he writes with the urgency of a late bloomer. And he started publishing in his 30s. He brought out his first book in his 40s. And He just has the output of Jester is staggering. His list of translation work tells you something about his appetite for poetry. He translates from Latin, Italian, Old English, Middle Welsh, and Chinese. And I think Middle Welsh is harder than Chinese. He's given us the satires of Horace. He's given us the elegies of Tibullus, the elegies of Maximianus. I'm going to mispronounce everything. Which I think that you should do on a podcast. I think that feels right. He has the elegies of John Milton. He won the Willis Barnstone Translation Prize for translation of the proto-feminist Welsh poet Machane. And then he taught himself the medieval Celtic language to render it. There was a poet where he believed it deserved a wider audience, so he learned Welsh. He is also a new formalist, which is the movement most directly responsible for keeping rhyme and meter alive in American poetry for the past few decades. He's won the Howard Nemerov Sonnet Award 3 times. And as far as I can tell, he's the only person to ever have won it that often. He is the man who is bringing us Petrarch in English this year, in 2026. He is the most decorated living writer of the English sonnet. This matters for the book that I have in my hand and the book that you will have in your hand, because Petrarch is the figure who effectively invented the European sonnet. So we are reading a translation by someone with a very deep, very lived formal authority over the very form that he is rendering. And that it's rare, and it is the central reason this edition feels different from anything else that has come before it. Now, there's more that I can say about Jester because, again, he's just such an amazing translator and poet. But I would like to get back to the poetry and show you what Jester's done. So, 3 things about the form, the way that the form held the poetry. The sonnet was not yet the sonnet. When Petrarch was writing these poems, what we now call a sonnet form was still being formed. He inherited it from earlier Italian poets, but he's the figure who made it the central love lyric form of Western tradition. And every Shakespeare sonnet is downstream of these poems. Every John Donne, every Browning, every Haydn. When you read Petrarch, you are reading the form being invented in real time. And Jester's translations preserve the octave and sestet structure and the turn at line 9 and the rhyme positions. So the form is doing its historical work even when we're reading it. So what surprised me is how much room there is inside this form. We tend to think of the sonnet as this tight little box, and Petrarch uses it as a chamber, and each one has its own weather, and some are stormy, and some are still, and some are open to argument, and some are open in dream. And the form is consistent. The temperaments are entirely different, but it's like watching the same room photographed at different hours of the day. It is the longer poems, the Canzoniere, they work differently. So if we look at poem 239 again, its end words rotate. So aura, flowers, poetry, notes, soul, power. You hear the same word return at line 8 that you heard at line 3. You hear it again at line 15. By the time the poem ends, those 6 words have done this kind of liturgical rotation. And this is what surprised me most about that. The form is doing the same work as the obsession. The lover cannot stop returning to the beloved. The poem cannot stop returning to its own end words. The form is the content. The wheel of language is the wheel of feeling. And you cannot escape the words because Petrarch will not let himself escape Laura. And when I read these poems, I just have to walk outside and just stand in the driveway for a second. It's just there's so much. But what I really appreciate is the translator's decision to keep the rhyme. Juster keeps Petrarch's rhyme scheme. He keeps the meter. This is harder than it sounds, and many translators have given up on it, especially in the 20th century, choosing free verse English equivalents that prioritize literal meaning over musical fidelity. Juster, of course, does the harder thing. And so in poem 31, listen to what the rhymes do. This gentle soul that flies off called to grace for other life, but far too hastily, if it is prized on high as it should be, will hold in heaven its most sacred place. So, grace hastily be placed. These rhymes are not decorative, but they make the cosmology audible. I feel like I could have read that better, but I think that we always could read it better. The soul ascending through the planetary spheres, Mars and the third sphere and the fourth, is without rhyme, this poem is just a list. But with rhyme, it becomes this cathedral. And Juster has given us the cathedral. So, 3 things I've learned from Juster's life, because learning about him made a big difference in understanding him. And I can say that this is usually how it goes for me. It's not how it goes for everybody, because I know it's kind of crazy, but people are different. But for me, I actually really appreciate the context of how it was written. And a really good example is the Whitman poem, The Lilacs in the Door. I could look it up right now, so I could have the authority to say it, but you know the one I'm talking about. And I read that when I was in my 20s and stressed out and trying to figure out how to make rent, and reading about, the train that went by and the lilacs in the doorway and how he loves his captain. I'm like, I actually have no idea what you're talking about. And that also is why I dropped out of grad school when I was 25, because I was reading all of this literature and poetry, and I did not know what it felt like to grieve yet. I was just working for years. I was doing the right thing when I was in my early 20s. I went to, paid my taxes, stayed home, never partied, I don't know what to say. I'm sure I'm a fun person later on in life, but I didn't understand because I didn't have life experience to explain the literature. And I needed that. I needed to travel. I needed to fail. I needed to learn how to bake bread, which is harder than it sounds. And I needed to live before I could return to literature. And so that's what I did. So that's why I returned and got my master's when I was in my late 30s, because I had kids and we had a home, and I, had 10 years of toddlers, and I can tell you that that is a life experience in itself. So when you read these poems, there's a life experience that is so helpful. But when you first enter, it's hard. So anyways, this is kind of rambling. But also, I'm rediscovering Ode to a Nightingale right now, because I've read it before. I've read it a million times. I've read a lot of poetry a million times. But that one, all of a sudden, I understood. It's like his brother had just died, and he was standing outside and he heard a nightingale, and he could hear the nightingale, and he couldn't hear his brother. And now I know exactly what it feels like when you have to stand outside and everything is just too much to bear, and you're looking for something to help and something to answer. Why does this feel so much? That's what poetry does. Anyways. So learning about Petrarch's life, my goodness, it was so helpful. So from the introduction, he was the son of an exile. He never had a fixed home. His father was banished from Florence during the same political purge that exiled Dante. His family moved to a number of places in Italy, and then Avignon. Oh my goodness, my French. And he studied law at Montpellier. He continued his studies. He returned to Avignon. He was sent on diplomatic missions to Paris, to Prague. He spent stretches in Italy. He had a life that was not just at the desk. These are life experiences that all of a sudden, when you read his poem 189 of being tossed at sea, that makes sense now. That is not a metaphor. That probably was a very literal poem. But he died in a very small town, and they renamed it to Acquarda Petrarca in his honor. I also apologize for all the Latin. I can do German. I took 4 years of German. In one epistle, he wrote, "There is no land, no sky that are mine, nor am I the resident anywhere, and so I am everywhere a wanderer." And that's one of the most arresting sentences I have ever read. It helps me when I'm reading his poetry. And also it helps me when I'm writing my own, because my family also, very stable family, but we just have been everywhere. There's no homeland. We've moved just kind of all the time. And my dad was born in California. I was born in California, but his brothers and sisters were on a farm in Canada, and that was a different farm than where his father grew up in Cape Breton, and then his father was from somewhere else in Scotland, and then my mom's side was even farther. So the idea of being a wanderer is helpful, and so that's something that I can read. I think one of the things that I liked most about this is Petrarch never finished anything, and that's kind of satisfying. The collection of poems itself was composed and then recomposed and then rearranged, and right up to the time of his death, and several of his works remain unfinished. He died, the legend is, and this is a spoiler, you should read this in the book, but the legend is that his head was on his manuscript when he died. So he was working until the very, very last hour. So he was a wanderer that wrote to the sea. Let me get 189, and I'll read that in whole. Okay, 189. My vessel passes through a hostile sea, amnesia laden in the midst of night, with Scylla left, Charybdis to the right, and at the helm my lord or enemy. Each oar seems manned by glib, cruel reverie that scorns the tempest and the end in sight, The sail was torn as steady rainy winds unite with sighing, yearning, and expectancy. The tears in torrents, the disdainful spray, they soak and loosen ropes already weak, which the mistakes and ignorance contort. My favorite sweet twin stars are tucked away, dead in the waves, are logic and technique, so I begin despairing of the port. Now, there's a lot more to say. There's a hell of a lot more to say. But here, I want to leave you with this. Love poetry is not dead. People say that love poetry is dead. They say it is sentimental. They say it has been used up. They say the language is exhausted. There is nothing left to do with the lyric I addressing the lyric beloved. Petrarch, 650 years from his own death, is that standing rebuttal, and Juster's new translation makes that rebuttal audible in English in a way that has not been audible for a long, long time. These rhymes are alive. The sea is hostile. The aura still moves through the flowers. Poem 189 ends with the speaker despairing of the port. The vessel is on a hostile sea. The dead in the waves are logic and technique. He cannot see his way home. And yet the poem itself is the way home. The poem, the form is the rope. The rhyme is the rudder. The making is the rescue. And Petrarch's whole life argues that the right to name the storm is earned through formal making. You do not get to claim the sea has been hostile to you unless you have written it well enough that someone else, 600 years later, can stand on the same deck and recognize that weather. I live on an island. The sea here is not the Mediterranean. It is the Salish Sea. It is dark. It is cold. It is full of its own difficulties. But it is still the same sea that Petrarch sailed, and anyone who has loved anyone and lost them knows that the helm is sometimes hard, and it is sometimes the enemy. And anyone who has written through a hard year knows that the sail can tear, and the ropes can loosen, and the spray can turn disdainful. This book is a navigation manual, and Juster has translated it for our time. Pick it up. Start at the beginning. Walk with Petrarch into the love that ruined him and the form that saved him. And you will come out, as I did, in love. All right, my good friends, that is all for today. If you have enjoyed diving into the world of verse with us, please join us next time, where we've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. So until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining us at POETICS Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one verse at a time.